So today, those of you who were at the early service, you probably got a directory. We're shy directories, so those of you who maybe are at the late service, we won't hand out any because we don't have any more, but we'll make more this week. And then we'll hand those out this coming week. If you happen to have a directory and you look your families up and there's an error in there, then please notify Stacy Painter. And maybe send me a text so that I can hold it against her as I tell her.
Hey, do we get send you a text at 5 o'clock in the morning?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, it's no problem. It's no problem. Believe me, I don't sleep much anyway, so we're good.
That's what my girl does.
Yeah, I've heard that your ringer is off. Okay, so today as we look at, turn to scripture in Matthew chapter 27, and also we'll be in 28. So let me give you some background of where we are. The way Matthew records it, he really jams it together. But I want you to appreciate, if you've never done this, read all four Gospels of the account of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Like I've shared with you before, remember that if I asked you at the end of this class, if I said, okay, would you all just kind of sit down and write out what you witnessed? All of your accounts would be truthful, they would be accurate, but they would be different because of where you sit, how you see things, what's important to you, what's not. And so the gospel accounts give us a lot of information, but when we only read one of them, you still have the story. You don't necessarily have the details that you would if you read all of them. So for example, one gospel account has 3 Marys at the tomb, and in Matthew we read about 1 Mary at the tomb. It doesn't change the fact that there were 3. It just means that Matthew is focusing on the 1 Mary, okay? And you do the same thing when you give a story or an account, right? Yesterday we were on FaceTime with our son-in-law and daughter and granddaughter, and they were doing a reveal for the new baby. And so I tell the story a certain way, and Katie tells it another. Now mine is more accurate than hers, but anyway.
Hers is more detailed.
Yeah, hers is definitely more detailed. And but so it's just fascinating how we tell stories. So appreciate that the Gospels, we're going to move into Mark next week, finally get to Mark, okay? And Mark was the earliest Gospel written. But appreciate that the Gospels were being written about this time, 35 years after Jesus was resurrected. The reason they waited so long is because what were they doing? Well, before they wrote them, though, what were they doing? They were telling the story. They were busy telling the story, right? And then they got to the point. Remember, it's still very much an oral tradition society. The population who read, I would have to conjecture. I've never, to my remembrance, I don't remember seeing the percentage of people who read during Jesus' day, but it wasn't all that high. And so it's still very much an oral tradition society. But it's really rapidly becoming one in print, or at least in the written word. So finally, the gospel writers realized, wait a minute, we're getting old enough now, we need to write this stuff down. Okay, and that's why you have the account where you have it. So, Stacy, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Please.
From noon till 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. In 28, 1 through 10. After the Sabbath at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. They will see me."
Thanks, Stacy. So we begin this lesson today because the whole lesson of the process, why it occurred, how it occurred, the crucifixion itself, and then what happened in those days in between the crucifixion and the resurrection are such an integral part of the gospel story that, and we just never have enough time to really delve into it. But I think it's important that you recognize that the crucifixion was an integral part of the whole story. Okay, if they would have, if they would have beheaded Jesus like the Romans sometimes did practice, not in this part of the world, but they did that at times, the story may have sounded different to us. Would the results have been the same? Yes. Yeah. And so I think crucifixion, though, makes the narrative more understanding for the historical setting that it is, but also because as we tell the message, it is such a unbelievably horrible way to die. There are certain accounts in history, in fact, even Pilate was surprised that Jesus had died already, because most of the men, many times crucifixion could take days. But the Jews, because it was the beginning of Passover, wanted them to all be gone so that it didn't taint Passover. They didn't want any crucifixion victims on crosses. So remember, in coming into Jerusalem, it's a major thoroughfare, okay, in that part of the world, major highway. So Jesus, even as a little boy, every time he'd gone to Jerusalem, he would have seen criminals be crucified, because the Romans did that as a public display of their power. Okay, what happens when you cross Rome? So there's always someone being crucified, right? And so we know that this was kind of for the Jews and the Romans, in order not to insult the Jews, this was the last crucifixion until after Passover. Okay, and so you read in some of the accounts that they came along and they broke the legs of the other two thieves, if you will. Some of your real early King James Version called brigands, okay, the bad guys, right? They broke their legs so that they could no longer push up and breathe, and then they suffocated. They completed the process. They didn't have to break Jesus' legs because he'd already died, right? So just appreciate that crucifixion kind of reveals the opportunity of where we're moving for the last part of this plan, right? Further appreciate that the other two thieves, the reason that there was the need to break their legs is because they had not been tortured like Jesus had. Okay, so he had been scourged. So the Jews had a law that you could only lash a person just with a leather lash or a scourge. You could only hit them so many times. 40 lashes, save one. In other words, never more than 39. The Romans didn't have that. In fact, many people who were being crucified, if they were scourged by the Romans, died before they ever got to the cross because it was so horrific, tearing the flesh, bleeding, blood loss, shock, which fits into the narrative of why Jesus was so weak that he couldn't carry the crossbeam that he was on. So you just have to appreciate that the crucifixion is the narrative we know and understand, and it is historically significant because it fits exactly what was happening at the time, which adds further credibility to the whole story. Okay. Questions on the crucifixion? You think what? Okay. Yeah, it's a horrible way to die. Of course, in the United States, we think injecting somebody and then dying in a few moments is a horrible way to die, and it probably is if you're the person. But think of crucifixion being hours or days long. Just horrible. Yes.
Well, when they took him, lowered the cross and took him off, how'd they get the nails out or the spikes?
Just pull them out.
Yeah.
So
Just-
for a Jew, the hand is considered midway up on the forearm and down.
Yeah.
So we depicted correctly that they drove the spikes through his hands. Well, in between the phalanges, there's nothing but some flesh it would just tear out. So they always drove between these two arm bones because it wouldn't pull out. And that's why they have recovered, archaeologists have found bodies of those who've been crucified and their thumbs over like this, because it cuts that
Yeah.
main
But
ligament.
then they put foot over foot. I mean, that would be a lot to.
Just as a quick side note, there's more archaeological evidence to indicate that for many crucifixion victims, they would only tie their feet to the bottom. But in Jesus' case, it talked about piercing his feet, and they would have had so if you had a post like this, they would have put his feet on either side and drove through the sides here like this.
Oh, okay.
So there would have been two different spikes used. Yeah, they just pulled them out because the same cross and crossbeam was used because wood was not easy to come by in Jerusalem. So they just used the same crosses. The Romans were very efficient. I mean, they were very efficient in capital punishment. Very efficient. So, okay. So now look at your outline. What are the important parts of God's plan here? And I wrote them down for you, okay? Because this is kind of a process, if you will, to understanding how to describe and articulate your faith. So he was crucified. We know that he was dead. He was buried. We practice our faith that on the third day he rose. And then we also believe that he ascended, right? What do you think of when you see that outline? The Apostles' Creed. Okay. So the Apostles' Creed was written, okay, by the early church fathers, if you will, for the purpose of being able to describe the reason that we have our faith the way we do. So the Apostles' Creed is just not something to be said, rote memorization. It's really understanding an outline of your faith. It's kind of a cool way to look at it, right? So think, he was crucified, dead, he was buried. Third day he arose, he ascended in heaven. That is a total description of Easter. Right? So it's simplistic, but it's a way for you to kind of walk out of class here today, I hope, understanding that don't overcomplicate the whole message of Easter. Right? The Apostles' Creed was a way, particularly in oral tradition, to teach early people who maybe couldn't read or write, or in some cases who had no understanding of what went on, was a very simple way for them to learn, and then they could repeat it to other people. Okay, so when you start thinking about, if someone says, well, what does Easter really mean? The Apostles' Creed is a great synopsis of that. And many of us have learned that just over rote memorization of saying it over and over again. So good questions there. All right, chapter 28, 1 through 10 is really the story I want to focus on today, that resurrection story, okay? So I've told you that some biblical historians, they struggle with the traditional way of looking at the days, right? So we traditionally say that Jesus died on a Friday, okay? We say Good Friday, which is really a misnomer. It's good for us that it happened, but it really is an Old English word. Good was an old English word that it translated good instead of holy, but what the Old English word really means is holy. So really we should be saying Holy Friday. It's Holy Friday. So he died before sunset. So to a Jew, that's a day. Okay, that's a day. Granted, he died, and then a few hours later, the sun set, but it's a day. And then Saturday, he's in the tomb, and Sunday, he rises. Third day, 1, 2, 3, right? Some biblical scholars suggest that because it was such a huge Passover during Jesus' day, that many celebrated Passover not on a Friday but on a Thursday, because they just couldn't logistically handle it all. And so if that's the case, then you really get into this 24-hour cycle. If he really was crucified on a Thursday, now you have 24-hour cycles of 3 cycles. But at the end of the day, I can probably argue either way, and I'm not sure if I can prove either way. So I don't know if it's important, right? So let's look at this story again. You see that to a Jew after the Sabbath, the Jew, Saturday would be the Sabbath. Okay, so after the Sabbath, that would mean at sunrise, which is why we celebrate sunrise. At sunrise on the day after Sabbath, they are no longer bound by the laws that they were under as a good devout Jew to work, number one. Number two, to be in the presence of or touch a dead body. Okay, they couldn't do that any other day. They had to wait until after the primary Passover was celebrated and after Sabbath occurred. So the next day, which would be Sunday on our calendar, is when they went to the tomb. Okay, remember when they took Jesus down, it was almost sunset. So if sun would have set and anybody would have been in Jesus' presence or touched him during that time, they would have not been able to celebrate Passover because they would be considered unclean. And by most Jewish traditions, you have 7 days after you have been declared unclean to then become ritually clean. So they couldn't have celebrated Passover if they would touch Jesus. So that's why they waited until that day. All right, just understand the logistics. So here you see Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. There's a lot of evidence that there were really 3 Marys. Mary, the wife of Cleopas, that you read about actually in part of the Emmaus story. And then Mary Magdalene, who was a follower of Jesus, and then actually his mother as well was present. So if you read the other Gospels, you'll put together 3 Marys. So anyway, they went to look at the tomb, appreciate how a tomb is built. It was carved out of solid rock. He was actually in a rich man's tomb. They gave a tomb no one had ever been buried in. So most people, even the rich people, they would be buried in a tomb, which was not airtight. And then after a period of time, they would open the tomb back up to reuse it for somebody else. And sometimes they would just lay a body on top of another body. In some cases, the body had gone far enough to where they would then take the bones and put it into basically a box. And that's where the person would then be entombed, because tombs were hard to come by, they were expensive. And so Jesus was the first one to use this tomb, according to tradition. And so he is in this tomb to prevent grave robbers from stealing, because many times, like we do today traditionally, sometimes when you look at a casket at a funeral service, you'll see that they got their wedding band on and maybe a necklace or something like that. They're buried with it, right? In many cases in Jesus' day, the same thing happened. The family wanted something special with them, so they would lay it in the tomb, and then grave robbers come along and steal it. So to kind of prevent that, the wealthy had developed where these tombs were, that it was always usually on a slope. There's a lot of hills around Jerusalem anyway. And so as they carved that out, it wasn't a very big hole, okay? And then it would go up inside. So they would dig out almost like a little bit of cave with a little bit higher roof. And then they would have a shelf that they would not carve out. So it'd be like just a shelf that the body would lay on. So it wouldn't be on the ground. And so it's pretty small. The tomb, in order to keep the grave robbers out, always had a big round stone that was in front of it. And you're talking about hundreds of pounds. And they would carve out a trough up the hill. And they would roll that stone up, a couple men would, and they would take another rock and put it in that little trough so it wouldn't roll down the hill. Once the body's inside, a bunch of men would hold the stone, they'd take the stone out, the little rock out, and they would roll that in that trough in front of the tomb itself. So it's kind of like a safe door. You had to have a bunch of men. It couldn't just be two teenage boys who want to steal something or two men who want to steal something. It took a bunch of them. Okay. And so that's why, as you read more about the story, if you read other gospel accounts of how they sealed the tomb with the Roman seal, they would use wax and they would place it somewhere in the tomb and then take the governor's stamp and stamp it, which he wore. They would stamp it, which means you break the seal without the permission of Rome, it is immediate death. There's no trial. There's no trial. If a Roman soldier saw you break the governor's seal and you didn't have permission, they were ordered to kill you on the spot. There is no trial. They just killed you. So that's the seal was important, right? All right. Now let's keep going. As you look, there was a violent earthquake. That's when it's recognized by Matthew that the women saw this angel come down from heaven, and then it talks about going to the tomb and rolling the stone back. Remember, there are guards that are placed here. Okay, there are guards who are placed at the tomb because the Jewish rulers had gone to Pilate and said, look, they said that he would rise in 3 days. If they steal his body and that story perpetuates itself, we're worse off than where we are now. Okay, and so they knew the Pharisees were smart enough to know we got to prevent this from happening. So he said, well, go and make it safe, or go and guard it as you wish, which means he gave them a contingent of soldiers. Okay, and remember, a contingent of soldiers, Roman soldiers, is they would sleep in semicircles, fully armed, outside whatever they're to guard. The penalty for sleeping on your watch for a Roman is, again, immediate death. There's no trial. In fact, you're commanded as a soldier in the Roman army, if you catch a fellow soldier, even if they outrank you and they have fallen asleep, you are to kill them. And then you report to your commander, he was asleep, I killed him. So if they didn't like somebody, they just said, keep sleeping.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Oh my gosh.
Hey, he's dead. He was sleeping. I'm sure he was. So anyway, yeah. So again, this has so many pieces, gears in this gearbox that work. It's just kind of fascinating. And then they describe in detail what this angel looked like. Like lightning, meaning the brightness of it, and clothes white as snow. And then the guards were so afraid they shook and became like dead. It was like petrified, right? I mean, imagine if you were a polytheistic Roman who really didn't believe in gods, believed in whatever you wanted, and all of a sudden you see this angelic figure so bright it hurts your eyes, and you don't see anybody touching it, and the stone rolls up the hill and rolls away. You're pretty scared, right? Pretty shocked. And so there you are. And then that's when the angel says, do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. So you see, here's the story in narrative form. He is not here, he's risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. So they're saying, look at the evidence. Look at the evidence, right? Then go quickly and tells the disciples he's risen from the dead and is going ahead of you in Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. It's interesting that Matthew puts that part in. Now I've told you. In other words, my mission is complete. The angel's done, right? So that story of the resurrection is important. Again, if you read the other gospel accounts, you see it all put together with more details because you add the details all together. And I've been listening to J. Warner Wallace, who is a police detective who primarily focuses on cold case murders, and he's become a Christian, and so he's a Christian apologist, defender of the faith, and he's always talking about evidence. And when it came to this part of the scripture, he had this to say. He said, if there is a murder and I'm called out to the scene, he said, the first thing we always tell the police officers is you keep everybody separate. Do not let them talk to them. Okay? Every witness has to be separated. And he said, then we get their accounts. And he said, I have no expectation, none whatsoever, that their accounts will be the same. He said, that's okay. It actually adds credibility. Because again, he said, you know, a man and a woman see things differently. Somebody who's 80 years old is going to see things different than a 20-year-old. Even the angle and position they're in, okay? Their ability to hear, their ability to see, process all that. Education levels, all different on how they see things, right? He said, but I take the account of all the eyewitnesses. And he said, then I build the picture of what actually happened. And he said, it's unimportant that one might say he was wearing a brown leather jacket and one says a black leather jacket. He said, that has a little importance, but he said, I narrow it down to the facts that are shared and the information so it gives me a total picture. So think of this case is the witnesses to this who tell the apostles about this, or the disciples. They're standing in different places, you know, and so it all looks slightly different to them, right? And so that matters. Now, all that being said, you have kind of an idea of what happened. That's when Jesus comes back onto the scene, and you know he talks to the Marys, and that's when we begin to get the final picture that hey, he has risen. Now you could debate, and probably with some accuracy, why didn't they recognize Jesus? How could they not recognize Jesus for who he was? And so, does his body look different? Does his spirit body look different than his earthly body? Or were they so distraught, upset, unexpected that they didn't expect it? I just had a guy come by the house recently who I hadn't seen in probably 10 years, and he was wearing a hat. And I reintroduced myself to him. And I go, oh, it's you, Mike. I mean, once he lifted his hat up and spoke, I knew exactly who he was. But at first, I didn't know who he was, okay? And seen him in 10 years, plus he had his hat on. And so it looked different. And we weren't in a normal setting where I'd see, right? So we have to appreciate that sometimes we kind of say, well, did you recognize him? And there are circumstances that prevent that. So what did Jesus look like? I don't know, you guess. We probably both right, right? At the end of the day, we just recognize that they didn't recognize him. And that is another part of the story. It's pretty cool because it gives us a little bit of understanding into the difficulty of even those who were on site not getting the story. So maybe that gives you a little help, a little permission maybe at times to say, I don't always get the story. They didn't either. And they were eyewitnesses. So give yourself a little break sometimes. Now, here's the next question. Why does the story of the resurrection become so important to Christian faith? Why does the story of the resurrection become so important to Christian faith? Exactly. It is the defining differential in world religions. Okay? There's no other world religion where someone died for them and then a bodily resurrection occurs. None. Only Christianity. Even the Jews don't believe it. So it's the only thing that separates us. So resurrection becomes extremely important. If he hadn't, Jesus wasn't resurrected, then what's the story?
Well, why would you want to believe any part of the body? You can't believe that.
Good point. Pat?
Well, the Muslims believe that Jesus is a great prophet, as do the Jews and some of the other world religions. And a prophet like Muhammad lives and dies, but he's not resurrected. Whereas we have a resurrection.
So appreciate, that's exactly true. So appreciate that other religions believed in the life they lived, that they lived, past tense. And of course, we're believing in the life that he lives. Not just what he did, but what's to come. Beverly?
And Muhammad and all the Buddha and all that, they all died. They died of themselves. And Jesus died for us. There's other. People. They won't want to die. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, so see, in many religions, there was a great person, a great teacher, a great prophet, a great sage, a great wise man, right? And they were. I mean, some of the writings of Buddha are really impressive. I mean, they're very wise, right? Really smart guy, had some great wisdom, and those are people that we could look at and say, hey, they had some good thoughts. They lived a pretty good life. You know, they did some good things. But it wasn't specifically tailored to an individual, right? To someone. So just kind of appreciate that. Now, here's the part where you have to participate. What words can we use to share this part of the story? So if you're telling somebody about Easter and the resurrection, what are some words that you can use to share this part of the story? Do not be afraid. Afraid of what?
They're about to hear if they're hearing it for the first time.
Yeah, what you're going to hear. Okay, that's fair. What else?
Jesus said that most of that.
And we make that first. Jesus died for me. He loved me so much. He laid down his life.
Yeah, it's personal. Good. What else?
Miraculous.
Miraculous. Yep, miraculous. What else?
To say that Jesus still lives.
Still lives. Mhm. Good.
Details to verify what was the case. We went
So,
over a lot of them.
yeah, so we actually can, interestingly enough, there is a lot of historical evidence to talk about Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection. Not just what you read in the Bible. There's also a lot historically, archaeologically, it's kind of pointing to the evidence and saying, yes, this is the way it was done, yes, this is what occurred.
Thankful that the Romans kept such good records to have that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to verify is the actual Roman historians themselves, yeah. Yeah. That,
I think what happens here is all of this that's on the board. Jesus demonstrated the fallacy of the finality of death.
so, go a little further, Pat. Go a little further by what you're saying.
Well,
He proved that death could be overcome.
well, he proved that for each and every one of us, death is not the final verdict. That there's more to life, and that the important thing in life, and you refer to it as a faith journey or whatever, but the culmination of that is that death isn't final. There's more to it. There's more to life.
So probably you will struggle with this, but it's okay that you struggle with it. There are people who are our age, you pick whatever age you are, and if you ask them what happens at the moment that your heart stops, all brainwave activity ceases, what happens? They cannot articulate it to you. They can't explain it, they can't describe it. And why is that? They haven't experienced it, yeah.
Well, there's stories of someone that have died and then came back. Near-death experience.
Yeah.
And they'll relate these stories. You'll see relatives that they've never seen before. You know, a little boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is grandpa.
I thought he meant the kitten that was the neighbors that ran away. Okay, must be a different story. Yeah, it's the dog. It was the dog or the kitten. Yeah.
I was not unconscious one time, and what I remember about it was total oblivion to everything. Dark, no feeling, nothing.
Yeah. Pete?
The experience can be so overwhelming and maybe leaves you with such a sense that you've been with the holy that you're at a loss for words. Words can't describe what you've experienced.
Yeah, good way to say it. Yes, ma'am.
There's a lot of in the nursing facilities that I work at. So a lot of people who pass on, but there's a lot of believers, Christians that just led their lives just wonderful, and they are experiencing before they do pass on an angel.
Yeah.
They look straight at this angel, and we hear their conversation before they pass on. We've dealt with that with 3 of them so far.
Yes. of
I
course
think
there
some
was.
also have seen dead loved ones that they conversed with.
They come to get them.
I can also tell you though that unfortunately our work is not done. Okay, so the ones who are seeing angels, hey, it's good, right? What about the ones who look at you when we ask this question? They say, I don't think anything happens. So, you almost have to ask, in other words, we're just worm food? Is that all we are? We're just worm food? I mean, you die and you just decompose, is that it?
And you read in the scripture there this morning that while he was hanging on the cross, he gave up the spirit. Okay. Okay, so if Jesus was able to give up the spirit, so wouldn't people be able to give up the spirit at that time of death? Does that mean that we need that spirit to be able to articulate and remember everything that's going to go on at that particular point?
Could. So, I used to teach arc and gas welding, and in arc welding, we're using just a rod to weld with, not a MIG welder. It is easy to see when you become trained. It's easy to watch the molten puddle and to notice what's called the arc ring. And if you get used to it, you know where you are on the piece of metal and how the flow is going on the puddle and the strength and the penetration, the repass, all that. And when you get to that point and you see it, you really understand what's going on. But most people, when they weld, they blink more frequently. They don't know what to look for. They're frightened of the experience. So when you say, were you watching the molten puddle and the arc ring, and they say, I didn't see it. It was in front of them, but they didn't know what they were experiencing. And because they didn't see it, usually when they got done, I would look at the weld and say, looked like a pigeon flew over and went to the bathroom. That's not a good weld at all, right? So they are not any good at what they were trying to do because they didn't see the picture. So what happens to us as human beings is if no one has really ever told us the story or our hearts closed on it, how else am I supposed to think? Because if I say to you, well, I was told about all this stuff, and when you die, you know, you're judged, and ultimately you're going to spend eternity in heaven or hell. It doesn't speak well for me if I say I'm choosing hell. Right? I mean, how many people go, yeah, I'll make a choice. Yeah, I'm good with hell. Nobody says that, right? So instead, we delay the decision, we delay the process. Easter is about recognizing there are people in the world that don't think the way you do. They don't believe the way you do. So you can make kind of a choice. We say, what words can we use to share this part of the story? We can say, take it or leave it. We can go, I'm done. You go on to hell, it's okay. Or you can recognize that we've been put there, that maybe they won't believe us, maybe they won't hear the words, but we need to be sure that the Easter story is told year-round, not just today, right? I'm sorry, Cindy, did you hear me?
Well, a lot of times when you're dealing with someone in a hospital or they are on the brink of death and they don't know and they don't really want to accept there's a life after, sometimes you have to be brutal and say, one of us is wrong. Are you willing to take that chance that you're right? And then they think about it and maybe they're not as wise as they thought.
Yeah, it's, but remember, there are people who aren't sure, don't care to believe, aren't interested in the story, and they may not get that chance. They may not have you there, and they may not be responsive and coherent, right? That happens a lot. So I think I wanted you to hear the words that you can share as part of the story is I also want you to hear the words that there is hope, right? There is hope. All of us have that hope in what we believe. Remember Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And I think, Sandy, it's a great way that you put that. I've had to tell people before, suppose for a minute that you're right. There is no God, and I'm wrong. What have I lost? Maybe a little bit of time, a little bit of energy, but what really have I lost?
Nothing.
But now let's turn that table. Suppose I'm right and you're wrong. I've gained everything. You've lost it. So I'd rather be wrong and believe in it and find out otherwise than I would not believe and find out otherwise. Yes, ma'am.
But there's also something when, you know, we have our faith and we live our faith, that's comforting for us. and it blesses us and makes us a better person.
That's a great word too.
So we've gained by having that, we've gained that throughout our lifetime. Whereas other people will be struggling and they won't have that throughout their life.
So I just hope that you know there are words that you can use. And so I gave you some just little funny comebacks, which by the way, I don't use, okay? Usually Katie's right. Doug, you shouldn't say it that way, but I did say that. But I do want you to hear that I think it's important that you recognize that, look, it's not ultimately up to you to be the judge of the universe. It's up to you to share what the judge of the universe says, right? And so it's not up to me to say they're going to make it or they aren't going to make it. I mean, I've had family members come up to me after the funeral was over and say, do you think they went to heaven? I tell them, I'm sorry, I'm not the judge of the earth. I'm not the one who put it in the mail. I'm just the deliverer, right? I'm the postman. I'm not the authenticator of what you got in the mail. I'm just the one who delivers it. And so are you. We're just deliverers of the word, right, Pat?
Didn't Jesus say that on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah, and you know, if you really think about that part of the story, what a thing to say. Because, you know, within his vision had to be the ones who were his accusers, the people who had betrayed him, and the Roman soldiers who he can see out of the corner of his eye are casting lots for his clothing. Yeah, I mean, they're all there, right? You can see them all.
But don't you think he's referring to all of us from his time forward?
Yeah. So the Passion of the Christ, right? I think Mel Gibson's the director. Read an interesting article after that was done. The actors who were involved, when it came time to nail the spikes in, that's Mel Gibson's hands. He said, and you know, you keep believing what you hear on TV, but this was an actual authored piece. He said, because I recognize that every time I do wrong, every time I sin, I'm God in the spikes in his hands. So we don't want to miss that.
That part right there.
Yeah.
I wasn't no different than a Roman soldier that I was in this place.
Yeah. Now, let's keep going. Why the shared theme of angels and Jesus, do not be afraid? Why did both of them say that? Why did Matthew make sure that was recorded for us to read? The angels, remember, they told the Marys, do not be afraid. And then Jesus comes along and after he says greetings, in verse 10, he says, do not be afraid. Why did Jesus use that term, do not be afraid?
Do you think that might have got to some sort of ghost and not a real Lord? I mean, how many people saw somebody that
That's right, very probable. Yep, very probable.
Already wrote a couple there, but there's so much joy.
Good, thank you. There is joy in that. So appreciate that it's not just the way people receive the information, it's the way we process it, and it's what we do with it. So there is fear in people accepting Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. Okay? Sometimes it's fear of change. Sometimes it's control, right? I don't want to give up control. And worried about what others will see and think and talk about. All those things play a factor. And believe it or not, you gotta be careful not to use this language when you're sharing the gospel. But for most people, it's a fear. You know, something's gonna change in my life. I don't want to change. I'm a good person. I'm fine. You know, I'm a good person. I'm sure God will let me into heaven. Right? So we just appreciate that fear is a part of a lot of people's view of the way they see Christianity. Fear often keeps people from making a decision for Christ. You don't necessarily have to talk about it, but just recognize it. People are worried. What's going to happen? Am I going to be different now? How am I going to get along? Am I going to have to give this up? All that matters. Verses 11, 15, we did not read those, so I'll read it to you quickly. While the women were on the way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. See, the chief priest had gotten them to be hired through Pilate, so they kind of reported to the chief priest. When the chief priest had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews this very day. I kind of wonder if they did prevent it from being executed.
Well, if they were asleep, weren't they put to death?
Yeah, they still were
Yeah.
supposed to be.
I mean, they said.
Although
they
if you're
were
given a
asleep.
large sum of money, I guess you try any story, right? So why this reaction from the religious leaders? Why do the religious leaders react this way? Yeah, fear. They're just deathly afraid now. If this is true, we're really in trouble. But they probably have fooled themselves into believing this is another trick of the disciples, right? And so now they get to this part of the story that those who deny the faith will play on this as part of the story. Even today, there are people who say, he just fainted, he really came back to life, and he died later on. The faith is attacked on this very thing of what happened to him. Which is why, some point in the future, there will be someone who comes along and says, "Oh, we've debunked the whole story of the resurrection. We found Jesus' bones." It'll happen at some point. Because that's the only way you can attack the Christian faith,
Well, how do they
is
know
that he
it's
didn't.
bones?
Wasn't resurrected, that he didn't come back to life.
How do they know it was his bones?
Well, that's the point.
They can
But
say
the
it.
point is if,
They made it up.
Yeah.
so look, folks, here's a rule that Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister for Adolf Hitler, said it this way. He said, if you say it loud enough and often enough, eventually people believe it.
Mhm.
What's that? Oh, sorry. Okay. So look quickly. Look at your outline. So the reaction was this way because if they could refute the resurrection, there is no Messiah. He wasn't the Messiah. He isn't the Son of God. And therefore, as a religious leader, I'm still in power. I'm still in control. And we did the right thing. We did the right thing. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder what, when they, after he was crucified, they said, I wonder how, did it register with them that what they had done? You think they thought, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that?
So remember how the human mind works. Just once, maybe twice in 42 years of blissful marriage, I have been wrong. Just once or twice. But I stick to my point. And believe me, I'm going to fight to prove that I'm still right, even though I know I'm wrong. Because I got to win, right? And think of the religious leaders of the day. Well, first of all, if he was resurrected, then as a religious leader, I'm one of the guys who voted to kill him, the Son of God. Whoops. Okay. I like to joke with people, can you imagine when the high priest Caiaphas, when he dies and he's standing before God and Jesus is sitting right at the end of the throne there? I wonder, I bet Caiaphas goes, ruh-roh. I mean, think about it, right? And that's how they have to handle this. Because otherwise, we murdered the Son of God. So they're gonna, if they're standing on a block of ice that's wrong, they're still standing on the same block of ice, right? I mean, they gotta go the full way, full measure, right?
They
All
were
right.
wrong and they should have been, they should have known.
Oh, yeah.
That makes it even worse.
Oh,
When you're a
yeah.
high religious leader
Yeah.
and you get it wrong.
Yeah.
That makes it
Mhm.
worse than somebody that didn't know.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, Frank, it's a good point. That was God's plan, because look, God didn't close their minds down. God knew how they would react. Okay, and so God knew, here's the plan. They're gonna do this, they're gonna do that, they're gonna do this. How do I know that? Not because I'm making it, because that's the way they are, right? It's the way they are. I mean, that's psychological experts know a lot of things about how crowds and people react because that's the way people are. And many times the better ones will say, well, if there's a gunshot over here and the crowd hears it, this is what they're going to do. And they can tell you what's going to happen, and they do it, right? Almost everybody does the same things. Crowd reaction, right? Now,
God gave them
let's-
a choice.
let's
to
keep
believe
going.
it.
What are the results of either? If you make up or ignore this, or you make up an alternate ending, the results of either are that it tries to dispel the whole Christian faith. It dispels the whole movement of Jesus. So they could have gone one of many different ways. They could have said his body was stolen. They could have said, he fainted and he woke up and he's walking somewhere else. They could make all that up. The alternate ending, though, the results are they're trying to dissuade people from their faith. Now, do you feel the need to push? Do you feel the need or the push to make known the story? That's, I believe, the important part of us understanding our Christian faith on Easter. We celebrate it. We rejoice in it. We have comfort and joy in it. All good things. Okay, congratulations. You and I should feel this way. But if we leave this place and it doesn't instigate in our hearts, if you're not feeling God's Spirit move you to sharing that story all the time, then I would say you're missing the full measure. You're getting part of it, but you're missing the full benefit of your faith. So the challenge, I believe, for you and me, is that we have to be helpful to other people. We have to be willing to share the story. We can't give up just because they say, how can you believe in a God like that? How can you believe this? How can you believe that? You just have to continue to say, it is my hope. It is the promise that I hold on to. I heard one person, I've stolen this, I can't remember who said it. After you've used something 3 times, it becomes yours anyway, right?
You're allowed to tell it.
Not only do I believe it, but I'm counting on it. Okay? I not only believe the story, but I'm counting on it. So I think sometimes don't overcomplicate the message in the story. The question at the bottom is important. Are you willing to help others to be ready for eternity? That's the Easter story. Because Jesus, the angel said, okay, in verse 7 of 28, then go quickly and tell his disciples. And then Jesus says in verse 10, do not be afraid, go and tell. So we are called to go and tell the story, right? So my prayer for you is that you want to share the story, that you take an opportunity, be sensitive that the story can be told to people. And that's important, because otherwise they'll never have an eternal Easter. We will, but they won't. Let's end the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for reminding us of this story, the comfort and the joy and the peace that it gives us. It is the foundation of our faith. and help us to be willing to share. In Jesus' name, amen. Happy Easter. Yes, please do.
So I have a question. I know the Trinity.
Okay,
is
what
three
time
of
today?
one. So it
10.
says when Jesus,
Oh,
God
afternoon, okay.
raised his son,
Thank you.
he's in heaven, sitting on the right hand of God, Father, 2,000